Well, I'd like to thank the organisers for an extremely stimulating conference, which has looked at two wicked problems: multi-domain operations and urban warfare, and looking at how they could be combined to be a synergy, or indeed how our opponents might combine their equivalents to achieve uncomfortable synergies on us, I think are really profitable topics of discussion. I'm Ben Barry, the Senior Fellow for Land Warfare at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and someone who's dabbled in this throughout my military career. And I've got with me, reading from left to right, John Spencer, who you've already heard from, Sahr Muhammedally, who you've heard from, Ian Harrison, a retired Army officer from QinetiQ, the Defence Technology and Advisory Company, and then Major General James Bowder, who's the British Army's Director Futures. Now, I think what we want to concentrate on here is to answer the question that was memorably posed by Lenin: what is to be done? So I'd like to try and centre our discussion on that. And we'll begin with each member of the panel. I've asked them to consider, in the light of their experience and today's discussions, what is to be done? What is to be done either by HQ ARRC or NATO land formations more generally? And I'll start off by saying that it seems to me that they've got to adopt an approach where urban operations are the new normal, and that armed forces that aren't competent in urban operations will increasingly be seen as incompetent. But you've also then got to fuse it with the opportunities offered by multi-domain operations, and indeed the threats that enemy multi-domain operations will pose. And it seems to me that within all this, it's war amongst the people. And also there's a battle for the narrative. And although I see the 5 different domains of multi-domain operations, it seems to me that that needs to be considered in conjunction with a conventional military operation, but also this battle for the narrative, and nowhere has better illustrated this than Ukraine. And we'll start with General Bowder, if we may, and then work along.
Okay. Thanks, Ben. So your question was, what is to be done? And I suppose my simple answer is a lot. But to my mind, the what is to be done is less interesting than what's the first thing we do? Like, where do we start? And I mean, I find conversations on MDO quite disorientating because the scale of the challenge is so broad. So in terms of the first step, it's trying to perhaps retreat back from what is a postgraduate level challenge in terms of sophistication, and retreat back to this notion of perhaps a high school diploma. What level? I mean, the central premise of today is that we are sufficiently integrated within the land component to do the really hard stuff and get up to postgraduate level in terms of the next bounds beyond integration with the land component. I can say, as the British Army's Futures Director, we are not at the requisite level of sophistication in terms of how the sub-elements of the land component can interoperate. So I guess the first step, to my mind, is ensuring that within NATO's land component, we are appropriately interoperable in a way that we just aren't sufficiently at the moment. The reason I say this is that what Ukraine has shown us is how difficult ground maneuver is. How difficult contested combined arms maneuver is, even within single nations, for single nations to do well. So therefore, to work to ensure that we succeed as an alliance in the first battle and in the second battle, if it occurs, we are going to be armies and ground forces bumping up against other ground forces from other nations. We absolutely owe it to the NATO joint force that the NATO land component is well practiced, has the appropriate processes, but also the technological protocols and capabilities necessary to interoperate with confidence. So to your what must be done, there's a great deal to do to get to the level of postgraduate confidence in multi-domain operations. But my goodness, the first step, the necessary first step, is to ensure that the meat and potatoes, granular interoperation and interoperability is privileged appropriately in the next 3 years. And that can only be done, actually, I think, by thinking about war in the particular rather than war in the abstract, to think about real ground and real problems, and therefore identifying who our partners are likely to be and allowing us to then have an appropriately applied conversation about how we interoperate with them. Ben.
Thanks very much, General. Ian.
Thanks, Ben. Just to lay out front, Ben did say it wouldn't matter too much if we all said, broadly speaking, the same thing, because it might just reinforce the narrative. I'll come back to that in a second. But you know, what to be done? I mean, you might imagine that the industry guy says, you know, better technology or more bombs and bullets. But and I think, particularly from the conversations we've had today around the urban, that there is a challenge for an organization like ARRC and its equivalents in other nations about what the most appropriate thing is. Because I sense that discussions around urban operations rapidly descend to scaling ladders, and that pun is intended, or micro UAVs, where actually what's the value add of this level of command? And therefore, almost sort of echoing James's point, it really is fundamentally about getting the right tools to ensure command and control in place. It has to be the thing that underpins almost every other aspect of multinational, multi-domain operations. At the most basic, it's securing the ability to have a common operating picture, potentially be sending digital orders, some of the specialist sensor to effector to decider mechanisms, and potentially also secure voice. And you don't need to integrate everything all the time or everything from day one, but I think that really needs to be the heart of it, and probably with a little bit of pragmatism up front. But it is about achieving that genuine interoperability. Technical, for sure, through the sort of standards, the open systems, STANAGs really at the heart of that. And the procedural side underpinned by standing operating procedures. And I think the opportunity for better interoperability and command and control, integrated command and control, is really to explore different ways of doing things and evolving the ways of operating because of that. And then fundamentally also the cultural dimension. That's come out several times today, but it's all very well being able to interoperate with each other technically, but if the cultures aren't there and aren't practiced as well, it's going to be really challenging. I just sort of, and what's to be done and what to do first. If you are or achieve what you measure, I just wonder how you're actually evaluating interoperability in both a technical sense and in some of the other senses as well. The technical evaluation of the digital backbone as it evolves and who's doing it and reporting to whom. I would observe that's probably something worth looking at. And finally, just to wrap up, you're not going to get a big bang capability, and therefore it's harvesting and harnessing those multiple things that are going on both within land forces or amongst land forces internationally, but also with the other commands and other domains as well.
Thanks, Ian. I was struck by how much what you said about the human aspects of interoperability coincided with the excellent talk on the issue that the Polish Army chief gave at the IUSI Land Warfare Conference in London 2 weeks ago. So it's very important we get a civilian and humanitarian input to ground us.
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to thank ARRC for having this day, this study day. It shows tremendous leadership on your part to dedicate the time and resources to study one of the biggest challenges in studying urban warfare. And also, I would like to thank you for inviting CIVIC. We participated today, but also in previous conversations, in trying to raise some of the challenges, as you said, the civilian perspective, and also the fact that one of the first panels today was, and we had the opportunity to discuss protection of civilians. And I think from the next steps, as you think about how to solidify and strengthen their learning, maybe ARRC can be sort of the lead unit within NATO that becomes the schoolhouse for studying urban warfare. I know, John, you're a big schoolhouse guy, and maybe I'm taking his talking points. But, we do talk a lot, so we learn from each other. But, I think ARRC has given over the last few years that you've been studying this topic and you are bringing in a multi-stakeholder approach to the problem set, I think it's really important. And so ARRC has an opportunity to maybe take the lead in developing the doctrine on urban operations, developing the training, the policies, and given how multi-domain operations can be leveraged in the urban environment, thinking through, again, from my lens and from the humanitarian lens, is how do you leverage, how you integrate protection of civilians in the strategic, operational, tactical level? Because then that also leverages the resources. And civilians are not an afterthought that only the G9 or the civil affairs team works on, but it's integrated in all warfighting functions. And now I'm actually speaking some of my sidebar conversations earlier today. But I think it's really important. ARRC has a really unique opportunity to really move this forward. And again, thinking through the protection of civilians component as a key pillar on the next steps is really important. So I'll stop there.
And over to John, who's one of the world's great experts on urban warfare.
Well, I consider myself a student, an expert of nothing. And actually, that's one of my points, is I've been a part of a lot of major studies on urban warfare. And you may not even know that NATO had a 5-year-long study called the NATO Urbanization Project, which produced a report, and then not much action happened after that report. I myself was a part of the 2014 megacity study for the Chief of Staff of the Army. Over a year, just looked at megacities, provided a report. Number one recommendation was to create an urban center. Until we decide to train, man, and equip for urban terrain, like some senior leaders have asked for, the gap isn't in capabilities, although I could list, and my friend Stu could do way better than I could for DSDL, list capability gaps that we have for urban warfare, depending if you're defending or attacking. But the gap is in expertise. So me and Sahr go next week to go teach at the only one that I know of, the urban planner course for division level staff officers, to understand within each warfighting function how to do division and brigade level planning for urban operations. Because success or failure in urban warfare historically can sometimes happens long before the fight starts, or it happens in planning. So my recommendation to the ARRC is invest in expertise, because even if you're going to exercise urban operations or wargaming or whatever, you don't have experts available to then guide like we have at our combat training centers, which are experts in warfighting functions, so they're not experts in urban warfare. So the importance of this course that we're teaching at is with the 40th Infantry Division was just a division commander who said, I think it is the most complex terrain, and I don't think that we have a handle on it. So they'll soon become the world's experts, not because they bring together people like me and Sahr to teach at this course, but because their staff officers are the ones that now grappling why is it different? What capabilities do I need that I don't have? How to use my capabilities different in the urban terrain like we've talked about today. So I think that's great that the division, although it's not resourced, but I would hope that other people could develop such a thing as a division or core urban expertise that would then be able to be the subject matter experts. We have experts in almost every one of the domains that we're talking about, but we don't have experts in urban warfare.
Thanks, John. And for the benefit of the audience, I think it's interesting that the 40th Infantry Division is a National Guard division.
That's right.
Of mainly part-time soldiers. And it's always struck me that armies that have large reserve components, in those reserve components, you'll have a proportion of people who are expert on some aspect of how a town or a city works, which is a capability that can be leveraged.
Okay, thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, if you just want to take your seats, and I will quickly try and summarize what has been a really rich day today. 2 slides, the first one blank, because I just want to give a health warning for what you are going to see on the next slide. I'm sure we've all been to really good study days before. We slap each other on the backs at the end of it, and we walk off into the sunset thinking what a great day it's been, but nothing ever becomes of it. What I want to try and do is to articulate an exploitation pathway. What we're going to see on the next slide is 10 themes that I've tried to synthesize together from all the panels that we've heard on actions to take forward in further research and development, led by the ARRC internally, we own that, but also to try and prick the conscience of a lot of stakeholders, be it UK or NATO or industry in the audience today, to try and pick up the baton on some of the areas that we've discussed. Now, although I've said I have no authority to task work, I will try and propose or amplify certain areas that I would suggest other actors or stakeholders get involved in to lead. And certainly for the ARRC staff, is that this is your homework for the next 12 months. Next slide, please. Okay, a busy slide. So just starting from the top, the first thing. So quite often within NATO, we do large warfighting exercises, multi-corps, multinational, multi-component. But whenever you're inside the bubble, it's geography. It's manoeuvring across geography over protracted distances. The last time the ARRC as a warfighting HQ on exercise Steadfast Liebe last December, we were moving across tens and tens of kilometers across Poland in a fictitious scenario. What we need is a scenario and geography that is purely centered on the urban, to try and give the commander the dilemmas to get after enabling the MDO discussions that we've had today. That doesn't exist. And if it does, it needs to also include the complexities of a city and how it lives like an organism, like what Gary Sullivan was saying as the head of the Staff Corps. More of that in a moment. Now, within the ARRC, we are trying to get after that, but we can only do it in the conceptual area. This autumn, we'll be doing a war game led by DSTL, supported by the ARRC, to try and get over the commander's dilemmas on how we would operate, fight, defend, or restore within a large urban area, a large European city. And it's that leads into the second point, which is how we actually fight. If we agree that armies are no longer large enough to have a contiguous frontage to fight on multiple fronts, that it's all about delivering precise chemotherapy to the living organism of a city rather than amputation that the Russians are doing in Ukraine. And during this war game in the autumn is to change the way in which we fight and the way we operate. And the nearest metaphor I can think, if you think of MacArthur in the Pacific in the Second World War, the archipelagos in which he danced across the numerous islands to get to Japan. He picked the right island to deliver decisive acts. Well, the urban area is the Pacific. And if we do the right MDO IPOE, the intelligence preparation environment, then we can try and decide within that city, the Pacific, which islands that we would try and converge on, as Jack Watling said, to have that temporal overmatch against our adversary at decisive time and place, to try and mitigate that lack of mass. And we will do that in the war game as a way of changing the way in which we operate and fight. We also want to promote the utility of terrain walks. The ARRC did a terrain walk in Poland a few months ago, where we understood how the Polish sovereign territory would be defended using the Polish VOT, territorial militia. Sits outside of the Ministry of Defense. It's not part of their armed forces, but it's one that would actually stand and defend and act as a civil security force. That would actually work alongside, under sovereign control, any NATO actors or activity within that area. Going back to Jez Strickland, as GOC 60 highlighted, is who are our partners, our proxies, who are the independents, Grandma, and how we deal with the ethical and legal dilemmas of working amongst those different audiences and actors for us to leverage. And terrain walks is a really good tool to try and bring people together to do that. So that's the ARRCADE Lightning. That's the name that we put behind them. And next year, as we prepare for our contingency for NATO at high readiness, is that we'll also do another terrain walk in another city somewhere in Europe. And we'll also think about that during our Thor series of battle staff training. Now, there are some people in this room that will remember the name of Exercise Urban Bear. This was 45 British officers, 1 star and above, having senior mentors from Sir Paul Newton and Andrew Sharp in the audience today, led by the then General Patrick Sanders, who was Commander Field Army. We all went to Berlin. A little bit of history understanding Berlin, May 1945, but it was to try and agree and discuss some of the issues that we've been talking about today. But that was in 2018, and that was purely a British land perspective. And maybe now there could be an appetite to have something in NATO where NATO senior leadership comes together, not just military, but joint interagency, to get after another European city, to have a terrain walk, to discuss and really bring to life some of our discussion. And it's all about integration. When we go into a city, I mentioned the example of the Polish VOT. It isn't the NATO arriving to do an Article 5. It's NATO fitting in. It's fitting into a complex environment that's going to have numerous actors that we're going to have to work by, with, and through. And that's going to be really complex to understand. And the real challenge, and Chas Story mentioned this, is we're going to try and enshrine this into a playbook. Not doctrine as such. We don't write doctrine, and certainly a lot of nations have got some really good publications, really are worth reading. But this is something for the higher tactical operational level. It's something for a commander and a commander's initiative group to use as a handrail to get after some of the conversations that we've had today. It isn't just from a military perspective. It will need to be validated by other non-governmental and international organizations, some of which you've heard from today, ICRC, Civilians in Conflict, to name but two. But also to draw in the rich experience that we have from our reserves, and all nations have some form of reserve capability, and the Staff Corps. And Gary Sullivan mentioned that. To try and understand how you do flood towns, cities, areas, how you do open up bridges once they've been damaged, how you do tackle critical national infrastructure, but also how you actually get the authorities to destroy them. So north of Kyiv, nearly 300 bridges were destroyed. The person who gave the authority to that was the Minister of Infrastructure, a civilian politician. Back in the Cold War, a lot of us will remember the 9811 that we would sign, and we'd get a Corps Commander to sign it before you could blow a bridge up. Is Corps Commander the right level of authorities to destroy that national infrastructure if it is so critical for counter-penetration, for movement of civilians, because they're not going to stay, that they are going to stay and not be evacuated? So to get after that, and certainly the playbook will try and help stimulate the debate. We've talked about relationships with industry, relationships with our reserves and the Staff Corps. And it's really the one with industry that we were challenged on by the leader from Andril. The ARRC is a sandpit for experimentation. We're a sandpit that works alongside Director Land Warfare, Major General Chris Barry, but also D Futures from James Bowder, to try and bring, as James Roddice described, is the engineer, the technology, and the soldier together for a point in time to experiment on whatever that emerging technology is. And we are open for business, whenever we do deploy, to come along and use us as that sandpit for experimentation. But also, it garners a relationship of mutual trust and understanding, which is all epitomized within the Army Industrial Strategy that was spoken about by the last panel. We've then also got to acknowledge the centrality of society. In the ARRC, we're not just the proponents for urban and MDO from a land perspective, but also human security. For an MDO perspective, how do you get after intelligence, preparation, and environment? Traditionally, it's enemy and ground focus. Now we are suggesting it's far more layered and far more complex than that. And I think it was Jess Strickland that said, is what is the go, no-go in the information space? And how do you try and graphically superimpose that onto a briefing tool to try and give the commander a sense of how to employ operational art in the 21st century in an urban environment? That will mean that we'll have to change the way in which a headquarter is laid down. And next week, we're going to brief in command of the ARRC about that. It's no longer a warfighting HQ that does solely warfighting. It's doing warfighting within a more complex environment. He will be surrounded by MDO, led by JFIB, but we've also now starting to recognize that we have to have a C2 footprint that extends out into the interagency space. It will mean operational liaison planning teams alongside non-military actors. A bit like HQ ISAF in Afghanistan, it was hyper-connected across the organs of society and governance. In a warfighting scenario, arguably, it will be the same in today's contemporary operations. We also have to explore how we integrate with the other joint actors. Everyone talks about air-land integration. Very rarely do we talk about air-maritime integration. Commander Lancom, Lieutenant General Roger Cloutier, he's recently sponsored the growth of battlefield coordination detachments that sit within HQ AirCom that's based upon the ARRC's ground liaison element that we've had there hitherto to try and blur the seams between what the land and the air can achieve together, more importantly within the urban environment. We're also going to try and, I would propose, to extrapolate what is a rather successful grouping of the UK's Land Domain Urban Operations Steering Group. So born on the back of Excise Urban Bear in 2018, when the ARRC then became the proponent for the high operational level thinking for urban, is that a cross-TLB grouping came together, co-chaired by Chief Engineer Civil Mill Interaction with the ARRC and the UK's War Dev within Director Land Warfare. And together they got after the doctrine, the capability, the training estate at the lower tactical level. And I would advocate that perhaps now is the time to look at pan-NATO, whether or not to support NATO's warfighting capstone concept and the War Dev agenda. And what that Neil King briefed on from ACT is whether or not the market could actually bear such a steering group brought together to try and get us to take forward some of the things that I've articulated today. And then the last thing, and it's a shout out that John Spencer mentioned to 40th Infantry Division of the US, a bunch of reserves in Colorado that have come together for this urban planners course. If you want to understand the forward thinking of that organization, then I urge you to follow them on Twitter. And we've got ARRC representatives there next week as part of that course, hopefully to try and bring that goodness back to see whether or not there could be an appetite either within the UK or within NATO to take that great syllabus, but to bring it this side of the pond. And with that, I'll leave you to ponder on some of those reflections, and I'll now hand the floor over to Commander ARRC to do a final sum up. Thank you very much.
Don't encourage him. Right, we're nearly there. I just want to round the day off, really, and it would be impossible for me to try and summarise the richness of the conversation we've had today, thanks to everybody's participation from the floor and the superb insights and thought-provoking comments that we've had from everybody who's been kind enough to come and contribute to the panels. Kev's outlined the sort of real work that we need to take forward. So I'll just leave you with three sort of scratch pad thoughts from me as we went through the day. And I think no surprise they're all interconnected and hopefully touch on much of what we talked about. The first one is the levels of war. What is the level of war that the Corps fights at? And that links to the conversation we've touched on at several points during the day about the difference between MDI and MDO. And it matters because you need to understand what level the Corps is operating at to understand which of those things we're doing. And I'm a pretty simple fellow, as those of you that know me will recognise, and I always believe as soldiers it's our job to bring simplicity to complexity. Fundamentally, soldiering is a straightforward activity that, because we're humans, we complicate enormously. And I always think it's our job, particularly as commanders, to simplify things, and Ben mentioned that as well. So for my money, MDI, the integration, is the higher level UK doctrinal bit that's replicated across the nation's alliances that involves cross-governmental activity at the higher level. It's the domain of the higher operational level and the campaign design. And MDO is operations. It's just how we characterize our future operations at the tactical level, and it's what tactical formations do. It's how we bring together all those things that John Byram talked about in his multi-domain task force in order to win battles. Totally simplistic, totally fails to recognise that all those things overlap, but from a core perspective particularly, it also identifies the challenge that the conversation we're having under ComLandCom in NATO at the moment about what the cores in NATO are for. Are they for core warfighting? Horrocks said the core fights the tactical battle. Actually, that's not how we've used them in NATO over the last few years. We've used them for multi-core land component commands. We've used them for joint task forces. We've used them for NRF, etc. So that debate's ongoing, and we need to bottom that out in order to understand what the cores are for, and then we'll understand where we fit in on that scale of multi-domain activity. I think, as Ant King said, and obviously it grieves me that Ant King said this very valid point, but nonetheless, the core focuses on the close geographical problem, and that's good to hear, because if you spend too long at the higher level, you think you can wish these problems away. And I thought it was useful that at elements of today, the reality, whilst all that clever MDO stuff is happening in the background, there was recognition that at the front of all that, maybe at a smaller scale, there is still a really unpleasant, close, bitter tactical fight going on. And our job probably at the core level, whichever level we settle it at, is to enable that to go on and create the overlaps and seams with the other domains in order to assure them. More of that in a second. The second thing I think we've covered really tremendously thoroughly today is the appalling challenge of the humanitarian crisis that urban operations brings. And all of us, who study our military history, as many of you, if not all of you I know do, knew that, and now our television sets and social media are bringing that alive to us tragically once again. And that is an unspeakable challenge to us as commanders, but particularly as NATO commanders, because we've got to get it right, and we can't behave as certain other people have. To misuse that quote from the 60s, in order to capture the town, it was necessary to destroy it. As NATO commanders, that is not an option. And I set the ARRC team a little problem that I promised the Chief Staff I wouldn't mention this, but I can't resist it. But I set them a little problem the other day, and funnily enough, it came up again today in discussion, to say, I'm not sure we'll ever properly fight in a mega city again. Urban terrain, of course, villages, towns, pubs and clubs, as the jocks call it, but we'll never fight in a mega city again like Kyiv, like Stalingrad. I mean, look at it. We haven't got the mass, we haven't got the will, we haven't got the ammunition, and we haven't got the disdain for humanitarian realities that fighting in this environment that we've seen in the cities of Ukraine would demand. So that was my thesis to the team, and we actually had a very good debate organised by Chaz, and it came down pretty 50-50. Now, of course, it was an interesting intellectual sojourn. We might not have the choice of fighting in cities, and if there's a humanitarian crisis that needs to be alleviated, as Sahr said earlier on this morning, then we might be forced to go in. And that brings us to another really interesting point that we've totally failed to resolve today, and actually probably isn't our job to resolve, is, are we on the offensive or the defense? And those are two fundamentally different challenges. And I think the wider conversation in NATO is interesting because it's taking us to really explore that. So all of our previous traditional NATO exercises involved some sort of blitzkrieg by the opposition that seized great swathes of NATO territory, and we then went on the offensive because we're all soldiers and we like to do the offensive because we're attacking, and that's a good thing to do. Of course, wasn't where we were in the Cold War, but nonetheless, that's how our NATO exercises have played out. I don't think events in recent months have convinced us that that's likely. I think defence forward is where NATO's going, and in fact, James Bowder, talked very clearly about that, the requirement to hang on to what you've got, lest you lose it, and are never able to capture it. So were we to lose one of our megacities, I offer that our chances as NATO of fighting successfully to recapture it without turning it into Mariupol are very demanding and very limited. So ergo, get on the defence on the front foot, and that, of course, is where we understand from Madrid that NATO is taking us. I think the question that we raised today and we need to explore is, as we've explored MDO today, is it calibrated enough for the defence, or is it all still, like all of our doctrine and much of our soldiering, about the offence? So how do we offset that challenge? And what a great conversation this afternoon we've had about multi-domain operations. The flanks, I like that idea about us in the land environment focusing on the land battle, but then our job of managing the overlaps or the seams of that with the other domains. I think that's a very good way of thinking about it. And maybe we're onto something. Maybe that is the way to mitigate the challenges and offset the defender's advantage or offset the attacker's offensive spirit. And I do think it underlines the role of the Corps, and that has come out during the course of today. And of course, I would say that, wouldn't I, as a Corps commander, and I know that my fellow Corps commanders here today would all agree as well. But I do think there is something in that. What we've learned is how incredibly complex and difficult this challenge is. And there was a question earlier, I think, from Johnny about how relevant multi-domain operations battle groups is as a concept. And I think perhaps in 200 years, when everybody's got space and jets and lasers and all that other good stuff that you see on sci-fi, that might be applicable. It certainly isn't, in my view, where we are now. Multi-domain operations is enormously complex and needs a huge amount of enablers and experts, all of which are in short demand, and we struggle enough just to cohere at the core level. So it seems to me the Corps does have a huge role in taking the burden from those tactical formations and units who are engaged in the tactical fight. Technology, that's the exciting bit, and of course that's a key bit of unburdening it. And I think we've had a good conversation today about technology versus the unchanging nature of war. And what we've probably reminded ourselves today is that technology is important, but there's some unpleasant aspects of the unchanging nature of war that haven't changed and that still need to be delivered by somebody at the front end. What I found particularly interesting today was the comment that came out that actually the received wisdom that we need more combat troops and there's far too many bloated headquarters and the balance is all wrong and there's far too many logistic troops for the number of combat troops in action. Actually, when you think about it and turn that on their head, you don't need that many combat troops in the sort of battles we're going to be fighting, but if we're going to get the MDO, the sustainment, the shaping, and the deep fires right, we do need lots of experts and cyber warriors and targeteers and clever info ops people. So actually, the way it's going may be correct. That's quite counterintuitive to how everybody has been telling everybody who's ever run a military headquarters in the last 30 years of their lives that their headquarters are far too big. So interesting. The technology, I think, has been fascinating, and it's no surprise that we ran this in the Science Museum and not in the Victoria and Albert Museum today. One small comic aside, and sadly he's gone, but Con Marcom was here this morning, and he phoned me up the other day, and we were having a chit-chat, and needless to say, he gave me a hard time about tanks. He said, look, Nick, turns out these tanks all blow up incredibly easily, so the age of the tank is clearly nonsense. A few dismounts running around with anti-tank weapons in the woods and your tanks are all blowing up left, right and Chelsea and of limited use. And fortuitously, I was able to point out to him that the same could be said of the world's most advanced guided missile cruisers of the Slava class, which are also lying at the bottom of the Black Sea and should have been more than capable of defending themselves, which he had to concede. And the answer is there's nothing wrong with either of those bits of the kit, the tank or the guided missile cruiser, as long as you put good people in them, you train them properly, and you use the technology as it's designed. And that is not what we've always seen from the front, as it were. So interconnectivity, I think, as the new aspiration, very sound. And I suppose my final point then is that MDO is therefore, for us as corps commanders and the level we're operating at in NATO, is really the thing we really need to get after, because it can't be delivered at those lower levels. Now, we're on a journey. We all need to be on that. We've made the point, I think, that lots of nations have started with their own journeys, and we've heard a bit about the UK journey today on MDO and how that's developing. What we need to do now is cohere that with the overarching NATO control, and Neil explained very clearly how NATO are doing that, so we all need to work together to bring that into a coherent NATO approach to delivering what the higher level tactical headquarters can bring to win the battle. Lots of people will be engaged in the small, close, dirty, unpleasant, unchanging fight. Our job at the corps level is to enable them to do that and to take the burden of the higher level engagement, shaping the deep, sustaining the rear, and synchronizing that. And what we've learned today is that multi-domain operations is now the fundamentally critical part of that, and the wrap that we all need to get our heads around in order to enable that close fight, whether it's in the offensive or the defensive, in order to make sure that, as ever, the reason we're all here is, should the day come, we are as well prepared to prevail as we possibly can. I will draw stumps there only by saying a huge thank you to everybody for coming, for contributing, to our speakers for giving up their time and the effort they put into the preparation, and finally to the sponsors for coming, engaging, and also providing the finances to enable us to have a very good lunch and excellent tea and coffee, helped by the staff of the Science Museum. And finally, to the ARRC team under Chaz and the visits branch for pulling it all together. Enormous amount of work, as you can imagine, to bring you all here today and hear such a smooth day. So well done to all of them for all the hard work that's gone in the background. Thank you all. Have a safe journey home.